Yeah, we've seen the Russians continue their slow advance on multiple fronts, particularly on the Pokrovsk front, but also in other areas around Chasiv Yar. That has slowed down in the last few days, but they are slowly still advancing. The question is whether will the Russian advance culminate before they reach Pokrovsk, or will it culminate in the battle for Pokrovsk? It's very unlikely the Russians can do much more than that before winter this year.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And today we are joined by Major General Mick Ryan. Mick served with the Australian Army for more than 30 years and commanded units from platoon to brigade level. He's adjunct fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And his new book is called The War for Ukraine. Mick, great to see you again. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you.
Can we start by getting your assessment of the movements on the battlefield, starting in Kursk, with reports from both Ukrainian and Russian sources that Kyiv's troops have started losing some of the ground they seized in early August? How serious is the situation at the moment?
Well, I'm not sure that we'd call it a serious situation yet. The Ukrainians may well just be adjusting to more defensible terrain to go into a longer-term defensive regime there. It's clear that they've really stopped expanding their bridgehead inside Russia. And given President Zelensky's recent comments that we'll be holding on to Kursk for a little while yet, clearly the Ukrainians need to find terrain that's more easily defended with as fewer possible troops, whilst also imposing as many casualties as they can on the Russians.
How important do you think the operation is in Kursk for the Ukrainians?
Well, certainly the Ukrainians think it's important for several reasons. Whilst it's been a battlefield success, the reality is it won't be a success until it translates into political and strategic outcomes. The big outcomes I think the Ukrainians were after weren't just about Russian redeployments from the Donbass. What they were really hoping for is that the West might re-look at this war slightly differently, embrace a different approach, not just defend Ukraine, but to help it beat Russia and to speed up larger quantities of supplies. That is yet to manifest. So until we see those political changes, it'll be hard to say whether Kursk is a success or not.
We're talking on Thursday morning UK time, and it does feel that we could be on the eve or within perhaps days or hours of restrictions being lifted on using long-range missiles to strike military targets deep into Russia. I mean, as we're speaking, that hasn't happened yet, but it feels like we have been here before as well. What move is the right move?
Well, the right move is to let the Ukrainians strike the airfields. They need to strike deeper inside Russia to reduce the amount of missiles their fighters and bombers launch, to reduce the amount of glide bombs they launch at Ukrainian frontline troops. This has both military and domestic reasons. I mean, these Russian long-range missiles are killing Ukrainian civilians every day. But you're right, we have seen this debate before. We saw it right from the start of the war, whether towed artillery would be escalatory, and we've seen it every single time any consequential piece of equipment is looked to be provided to the Ukrainians. None of it has escalated the situation. It's always the Russians who have been escalating the situation as they continue to do so with Iran's new missiles.
And if we could just get your thoughts, your assessment of the movements of the front line, the Donbass.
Yeah, we've seen the Russians continue their slow advance on multiple fronts, particularly on the Pokrovsk front, but also in other areas around Chasiv Yar. That has slowed down in the last few days, but they are slowly still advancing. The question is whether will the Russian advance culminate before they reach Pokrovsk, or will it culminate in the battle for Pokrovsk? It's very unlikely the Russians can do much more than that before winter this year.
And on your new book, which I mentioned at the start, you explore the Biden administration's lack of clear strategy towards the war in Ukraine. What is the problem? What has been lacking?
Well, the big lack is an explicit strategy by the United States in how it's going to help Ukraine win. In fact, it's very difficult to find a senior US leader to say, we want Ukraine to win, as we saw in the Trump-Harris debate yesterday. Both were asked, do you want Ukraine to win? And neither of them said categorically yes. So that's a problem. They have an implicit strategy that embraces building a coalition to support Ukraine and providing military assistance, but it also includes, not starting World War III and not seeing the war spill beyond the borders of Ukraine. Um, it's not a real strategy, and defending Ukraine for as long as it takes is a slogan, not a plan. So hopefully the strategy apparently that the Biden administration has just presented to Congress, which is classified, but I'm sure will leak in the coming weeks, provides a better way ahead, a clearer way ahead for US support to Ukraine.
So, are you feeling in the coming couple of months before the actual US election that you could be optimistic about this strategy?
I think I'll stay on the fence about being optimistic about US strategy changing between now and when a new president is inaugurated in January next year. I think a lot of people are watching the US election for the outcome, even depending on who's voted in. I don't think we're going to see any change in strategy at least till early January next year. And we could well see a new administration of either colour call for a review into US support of Ukraine. So I don't perceive any change in US policy and therefore no change in NATO policy, at least until early next year. For the Ukrainians, that's a problem.
So, on the subject of the use of storm shadows, the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, when asked about permissions to use those missiles to strike deep into Russia at the end of the 24th Ukraine Contact Group meeting in Ramstein, said it wouldn't be just one capability that will be decisive in this campaign. I suppose he had to kind of fudge his response, didn't he? What else, though, would be needed to make things decisive, as it were?
Well, all the capabilities together used at their full capacity is what will be decisive. And at the moment, that is not the case because the Americans are um, limiting how the Ukrainians use some of their weapon systems, HIMARS, where they fire them into Russia, long-range strike systems, whether it's British or American. They came up with this excuse that the Russian bombers had been moved. Well, it's not just bombers that fire these long-range missiles and glide bombs. Lots of Russian tactical aircraft use them, and all of them are based pretty well within range of the weapons the Ukrainians can't use to strike airfields. That's why they've developed all their own long-range strike systems.
Mm. Iran now stands accused of supplying short-range ballistic missiles to Russia, which the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said could be used against Ukraine within weeks, following earlier reports. A growing alliance which threatens European security is how he kind of sees it. Is there a danger of a dramatic escalation in the war in this way?
Well, I'd suggest that it's already escalated because of China's support, North Korea's support, and Iran's support. All three are strong supporters of Russia. Indeed, the NATO communique this year called China the key enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. So we're already facing this authoritarian quad that is seeking to degrade the influence and the security of Europe and the United States. And we'll continue to see a range of efforts in Europe and in the Pacific for them to do so.
Can you tell me a little bit more about these short-range Iranian missiles and what it would enable Russia to do?
Yeah, these Iranian ballistic missiles have a range out to about 120, 130 kilometres, so they're not long-range systems. But what it will allow the Russians to do is to conduct strikes against Ukrainian military formations along the front line, as well as Ukrainian infrastructure within about 100 kilometres of the border, and do that in cooperation with things like the Iranian drones that the Russians have been using, as well as some cruise missiles. The Russians don't use these things in exclusion. They generally use cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones all together to confuse air defences and make sure at least some get through.
And if these shorter range ballistic missiles were to be used quite widely, how would that, what kind of capability would that give the Russians to strike deeper with its more long range missiles? What would it target?
So what it does is allows Russia to continue at a more sustained rate its strikes with cruise missiles that traditionally over the last year or so it's kind of pulsed for a little bit and then waited for a couple of months, then pulsed a whole lot more. What it will allow the Russians to do is free up some of those cruise missiles for deeper strikes and to have more continuous strikes on Russian infrastructure, particularly their power infrastructure in the lead up to winter.
So that is a serious concern then.
Absolutely. If you're a Ukrainian, you're already facing a pretty dim, cold winter. The Russians will be keen to ensure they make it dimmer and colder for the Ukrainians. As we've seen in the last 48 hours, they've sought to strike new power generation and transmission sites in Ukraine. And I think we can expect to continue to see that.
You said that in terms of the US strategy, which is at the moment not public, and we know very little about it, but you think it may leak out. What will you be looking for? What will you be hoping that it actually details?
I think there's a few important things. Firstly, I would hope that it's aligned somewhat with the victory plan that President Zelensky is briefing to American officials and probably to NATO officials in due course. You'd hope there's some alignment. They may not be exactly the same, but they'd have to be aligned. That's, I think, a really important part of the US strategy. A second part is, and I think importantly, is it should provide a compelling vision or purpose of the US support to Ukraine beyond just defend Ukraine. It should provide a compelling purpose that can be explained to the American people and to other people around the world why it's important to support Ukraine and why it's important to defeat Russia in Ukraine. They're two important things. There'll be lots of other bits, but they're the two key things I'll be looking for.
And you point out in your latest Substack that the Biden administration has shifted its focus in the war from a vision of total victory to one where Ukraine is better postured for negotiations. Do you have an idea of where it lies at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's probably still there, unfortunately. And I think this was one of the strategic objectives of Kursk. I mean, that aspiration or lack of aspiration by the Biden administration was based on the failure of the 2023 counteroffensive. They just assumed the Ukrainians were no longer capable of conducting offensive operations to liberate their territory. Kursk was, it's highly risky and it's a big swing, but it's also about showing the world that Ukraine can go on the offensive and that it is capable of liberating its territory, and therefore we should retain the strategic objective of returning Ukraine to its 1991 borders.
Just fascinated to know, Mick, when you learnt about that Kursk operation, what your initial reaction was.
Well, initially, like most people, I thought it might be something similar to Belgorod, but within an hour or two, I started seeing reports of conventional Ukrainian brigades, it was very clear this was something quite different from what the Ukrainians have undertaken before. I think just about everyone was surprised because most of us thought the Ukrainians would undertake large-scale offensive operations next year, not this year. So yes, it's risky, but it was very audacious, and it just shows that surprise is still possible in modern warfare.
US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy, they've been in Kyiv this week to ask President Zelensky for his goals in the war and what the US can do to achieve them. I mean, it's kind of quite interesting the way this has all been done extremely publicly, and you'd have thought maybe this would have happened before.
Yes, I mean, President Zelensky's been talking about his victory plan, since August, so it's hard to credit that the Americans and the British haven't seen some version of this behind the scenes. But it is good to see both the British and American foreign ministers in Kyiv talking to their counterparts. They'll be wanting to establish a relationship with the new Ukrainian foreign minister who's just been appointed, as well as the advisors and others that are associated with the new foreign minister. So I'd say the Ukrainian victory plan they're talking about is just one of many topics that they'll discuss during their important visit.
You've written that to have any impact, the US must make defeating Russia in Ukraine a key objective. What does it need to do to make that happen?
Well, firstly, it has to actually say it wants Ukraine to win. And that seems to be hard for American politicians to say at the moment. They need to say that. And then what they need is a strategy that supports that. That includes more aid, more quickly, as well as NATO and other partners like Japan and Australia doing exactly the same. More aid, more quickly, with an explicit goal of defeating Russia in Ukraine. Not only is this good for Ukraine, there's a strategic and moral imperative to do this, but it's good for the west of Eastern Europe as well. If we can defeat Russia in Ukraine, they'll think twice about taking on NATO partners, and China will also think twice about its aggression in the Pacific.
You mentioned earlier that the debates between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, notable on Ukraine, and that Donald Trump, when asked, he avoided explicitly saying he wanted victory for Ukraine. How I mean, I suppose that's not that surprising, is it? But what do you think needs to happen between now and the US presidential election to secure the best future for Ukraine?
Yeah, it was a pretty simple question, which both candidates turned into very complex answers that avoided a yes or no, which I think would have been appreciated one way or the other. So, what's required between now and then? I think consistency at a minimum with what the US has already been doing for Ukraine, additional aid packages of the $60 billion that was approved by Congress, only about a quarter or less than that has been committed so far. I think the Americans should speed that up. But hopefully, this strategy that the Biden administration has presented to Congress does provide that compelling vision for ongoing US support and does provide some consistency in the US support for Ukraine, as well as its leadership of the Ramstein Group and NATO's efforts overall.
In writing this book that you brought out that's been published in August, I mean, what other conclusions have you drawn from your research?
Well, what I really looked at was the strategies that both sides have used for the war, and I think that both Russia and Ukraine have adapted their strategy throughout the war based on how events have transpired, but also looked at NATO and US strategies. I think when we look at the big lessons about strategy in the war, firstly, it's good to have one. The fact that the US doesn't have one, I think, doesn't speak very well of the national security environment in Washington. It's more crisis management at the moment on this. It needs to shift away from that. But also, I think many others are learning about how NATO and the United States make these kind of big decisions, and they're learning both good and bad lessons. China, in particular, is watching very closely and is learning a lot of lessons about how the West perceives red lines, how it perceives escalation management, and how it perceives nuclear weapons and their role in deterring the West in intervening.
Mick Ryan, it's been great to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.